Hundreds of thousands of people around the world have been following the recent Kyle Rittenhouse versus State trial. During a BLM riot, Kyle was attacked by rioters and shot two of them to death in an act of self-defense. Although all the available evidence clearly demonstrates that it was self-defense, the left, the media, actors and politicians claimed, and some of them still do, that he shot black people, that it wasn't self-defense, and that he's a white supremacist. After days of deliberations, the jury proclaimed Kyle not guilty on all counts. The reactions to this and the confabulations that preceded it are the true mirror to the soul of not only the US, but the entire Western civilization. Justice appears to be in grave danger, and if we let the pathological ideology of wokeism to take over our institutions entirely, which is something we're already seeing dominantly taking place at universities, it's not too far-fetched to say that the disasters of the 20th century will strike again. But now, thanks to the desire for a technological utopia, they'll strike harder. What is this ideology an expression of? What are the goals of those who hold it true? In this video, I'll attempt to uncover the psychological and symbolical processes behind the ideology of the woke, the ideology that claims equality and representation for the minority groups, while it mows down all within its reach. Identification of the problem, merging and subversion. What characterizes the woke movement is the desire for liberation from the pre-existing patterns through subversion and merging, a paradox that doesn't create anything new, only chaos in what already exists. Thus, the primary function of this movement is infection, corruption, and destruction of the extant system. The modus operandi is based on the alchemical belief that only if we can do away with what's wrong will we get to see the golden core of the good unveil itself. As a result, an individual, an institution, a system, or a field are reduced to a set of attributes of which the undesirable ones must be done away with. This gives it a somewhat reversed religious subtone. As long as one does not possess that which is undesirable, can he be initiated. Group identity once again becomes a selective factor in which the desirable or undesirable attributes are united. For example, an individual is reduced to his Republican identity, which is seen as undesirable, and so the whole individual is seen as undesirable. As such, the individual is thus merged with the attribute, which means that he vanishes. It doesn't really matter what the actions of the individual are. He could be a most accomplished scientist or a sincere philanthropist. None of it matters. He's a white supremacist, a racist, a homophobe. In other words, in the subjective eyes of a wokeist, individuals become mere sets of attributes. An individual is seen as either in alignment with a set of desirable characteristics, in which case he's accepted, or he deviates from the standardized set of characteristics, in which case he's excluded. Let's now look at why I suggested that subversion and merging are the two modi operandi of wokeism. In the case of subversion, a simple process takes place. That which was in the corner is now being placed at the center for no other reason than that it's in the corner. The center is thus replaced by the corner. But what do you get if you swap the center for the corner? Well, it might be a big surprise, but you get exactly the same thing. A center and a corner. As a result, nothing new is created, simply rearranged, and thus the enemy that's being fought becomes the very product of one's fight. The intention to include and connect results in further perpetuation of exclusion, only this time, it's the foundation of the system that ends up being denied. For example, the woke claim that there are hundreds of genders, but at the same time, defined femininity and masculinity are denied. That is, unless femininity is turned into masculinity or vice versa. In the first case, what we witness is merging, in the second, subversion. It's enough to look at the movie industry to see how this idea is being played out. Hitler's personality was characterized by his obsession with purity and disgust with anything considered impure. That, of course, gave rise to his ideology. Anything marginalized was perceived as impure, secluded, and eventually eliminated. The obsession we see today is very much the same, except, of course, reversed, and both ideological and visceral. An example could be the gradual seclusion of the unvaccinated for being seen as impure or blemished, for instance. In the more abstract sphere, the marginalized is perceived as pure because of its victimized identity. Those who differ become saints for being different. It's as simple as that. This, however, creates a huge problem for those who do not, which is the vast majority. For example, Kyle Rittenhouse happened to be white and own a gun. This alone sufficed to create a massive uproar by the left. Why? Well, because he's not black or gay. That his case was of obvious self-defense, that at the moment of the incident he was a 17-year-old kid who tried to help out his community and had done so before, was all overseen. He could have been a saint incarnate for all it matters. He belongs to the centre, not the corner. Psychology of the individual drive, power dynamics. Underneath this belief skulks a spirit of anarchy and yearning for emancipation. When we dig deeper, however, we come across a desire for power, a wish to be admired, resentment and narcissism generated by creatures full of fear. Psychologically, this entire movement is a narcissistic obsession with purity and progress that emerged as a response to fears of basic human instincts, including fear of death in the form of suppression and desire for dominance associated with a fear of loss of this dominance. As for the first, the conflict between the mind, trapped in a temporary body alleviated by religion in the past, now seeks a different resolution, given that, as Nietzsche said, God is dead. Or in other words, now that reason has significantly overtaken religious belief. This cult of a narcissistic individual is one of the numerous attempts at creation of something one's temporary existence can be salvaged by. Except that this is of course vehemently denied by those who attempt to do so. This salvation is, however, in its nature Luciferian. One must become God himself. Thus, the desire to subvert and merge the powers which symbolically belong to God are taken on by the individual. Per se, wokeism is a religious paradox. It aims to elevate the individual by devaluating everyone down to a community in which the individual is then elevated as a community. It aims to create a hierarchy without a top, which is, as you may see, impossible on any imaginable level. In reality, everyone's in for their own sake. As for the desire for dominance, this is the more obvious part. The believers don't want equality of opportunity. They want to gain an upper hand, an advantage over those who already have what they desire, to be able to take it away from them, but achieve so through the aforementioned creation of a community. Bear in mind that this community is meant to be a means to individual acquisition of power, despite its apparently benign intention to usher in a utopia for everyone. Now, one could argue that in some cases it's not about power at all. Some genuinely care about those whom they believe to be the victim. And fair enough, but in such cases what we tend to encounter is yet another form of expression of religious belief or narcissistic wish. A kind of fantasy unresponsive to actuality is created, in which the individual then indulges. All this takes place without the appreciation of the process behind the fantasy by the individual. Only when this is consciously realized can be the individual possibly freed from the clutches of the subjective belief. And that goes for any belief related to denial of reality. In Jungian psychology, this fantasy could be attributed to the work of the magician archetype, the master of illusions who distracts and manipulates by altering perception of reality. This archetype capitalizes on the individual's own experiences of victimhood. Once the mirage is stripped away, however, a completely different person emerges from behind. I will explain this on an example of feminist action under wokeism. You see, the vast majority of SJWs is female. I hypothesized that in a quest for feminine empowerment, the female must give up that which is associated with the feminine, such as wearing skirts or being a mother, basically from the most trivial things to most fundamental ones. Naturally, since the quest itself is of a masculine nature, as its empowerment itself, and this oppression only makes the desire to express the feminine even stronger. Thus, conflict is generated. Clearly, this is accompanied by bouts of resentment. The individual creates a belief that she can't express her true desires because of the system, for example. In order to resolve this conflict, a fantasy aligned with these beliefs is created. The focus is then placed on the apparent victims of the society, which tends to include oneself, but not necessarily. This becomes a double compensating mechanism, so to speak. On one hand, the SJW gets to blame the system that's deemed responsible for the feminine underpowerment, and on the other, she gets to indulge in the desire to be a mother figure to those perceived as disadvantaged. It's not rare to observe a dramatic change in outlook after this fantasy has become consciously internalized, and the true desires come to the surface along with regret about all the missed opportunities and wasted time. Narcissistic fetish. In terms of the narcissistic nature I have spoken of, virtue signaling and self-idolatry are its most obvious mass manifestations. On social media, it takes an almost exaggerated form. It's as if the person went unhinged to such an extent that the fantasy took over the personality. This fantasy is being fed by an overinflation of ego that arose in compensation for one's misery, whether it's virtue signaling or self-idolatry. Why do you think people become obsessed with celebrities such as K-pop idols? And why do you think they're called idols? This often arises from concern about one's own image, which is a natural part of adolescence that normally wanes, but because of the environment that feeds this further, it often remains. The religious nature of this phenomenon is obvious, and we could again connect it to the God is dead phenomenon. In the woke, the fetish develops with minorities. Becker identified a large group of fetishes, and it may not come as a surprise, but their nature is compensatory. In this case, the obsession with minorities is a somewhat natural result of the precepts that form the woke ideology, such as reversal, as I explained before. Apart from that, they often serve as an object used to expand one's ego further through virtue signaling. Anyone familiar with narcissistic behavior can confirm that the narcissist is often, in fact, a weak dog that bites out of fear. The woke are often unstable individuals without any significant purpose in life. Their desire to change the world springs from their failure at changing themselves. And if there's no lack of status, there's often something missing elsewhere. An obsession with power is what characterizes them, whether rich or poor. It's also not uncommon to see exactly those who benefit from the current system the most to advocate its destruction, simply because they can't wait to become the top of the topless hierarchy, of course. And the rest just naively dream about it.